Ward 7. 3 of us went into Blackwater State Hospital on the night of October the 4th. 2 of us came out. I need to say that up front before anything else because I've told this story exactly twice before tonight. Once to a police officer who wrote it down without believing a word of it, and once to a grief counselor who kept nodding in that careful, professional way that meant she thought I was in shock, or lying, or both. And both times. I got so caught up trying to explain the parts that don't make sense that I forgot to just say the one fact that actually matters. 3 of us went in, 2 of us came out, and I am never, under any circumstances, going back to find out what happened to the 3rd. My name doesn't matter for this. Call me Cass, since that's close enough to true. I run a moderately popular channel where I explore abandoned buildings, hospitals, asylums, factories, the occasional shuttered amusement park. And until October 4th, the worst thing that had ever happened to me on a shoot was a twisted ankle and a collapsed stairwell at an old textile mill in 2022. I want you to understand that going in, I wasn't a nervous person. I'd been inside more abandoned psychiatric facilities than I could count on both hands, and I had a whole practiced routine of debunking the things people expected to be scary. The graffiti, the broken furniture, the sound of pigeons in the rafters that everyone swears sounds like footsteps until you actually hear real footsteps and understand immediately, viscerally, that you'd never heard the real thing before at all. Blackwater State Hospital operated from 1931 to 1974, a sprawling campus of connected brick buildings about 90 minutes outside the city, built in that era when psychiatric care meant more often than not a life sentence dressed up as treatment. It had been closed for exactly 50 years, and unlike most abandoned hospitals its age, it had never been demolished, never been redeveloped, never even been fully secured. The state owned it. Some indefinite legal limbo kept it from being sold. And the result was a building that had been slowly returning to the earth for half a century, while urban explorers, ghost hunters, and teenagers on dares slipped through gaps in its perimeter fence with a consistency that made it one of the most filmed abandoned locations in the state, and, according to at least 6 separate paranormal investigation shows, one of the most haunted. I went in with 2 people. Derek, who'd been my camera partner for 2 years, steady, funny, unflappable, in a way that made him genuinely good at this work. Nothing rattled Derek, which is why what eventually happened to him is the part of this story I have the hardest time saying out loud, even now. And Priya, a friend of Derek's who'd asked to come along for the first time, a nurse by profession, which felt at the time like a strange, almost funny coincidence. A nurse walking into an abandoned psychiatric hospital for fun, and which felt, by the end of that night, like something closer to a cruel joke that the building itself was playing on us. Though I know that's not the kind of thing you're supposed to believe about a building. I'd researched Blackwater for about 3 weeks before that shoot, which was longer than I usually spent on a location, because something about the place had snagged my attention in a way most abandoned hospitals didn't. Most institutions like it have a fairly consistent public record, commitment procedures, treatment philosophies, the slow arc from asylum to hospital to closure that traces the broader history of psychiatric care in this country. Uncomfortable, but at least documented. Blackwater's public record had gaps in it that felt, even before I set foot on the property, oddly deliberate. The hospital's own official history, published by the County Historical Society in a slim pamphlet I found scanned on a local archive website, covered the building's construction in 1931, its expansion in 1948, and its closure in 1974, following a statewide push toward deinstitutionalization, in the same dry, self-congratulatory tone these documents always use, full of phrases like compassionate care consistent with the standards of the era that always translate, once you dig past them, into something considerably less compassionate. What the pamphlet didn't mention, and what I only found by cross-referencing old newspaper archives with a state legislative committee report from 1972, was that Blackwater had been the subject of an internal state investigation in the early 1970s, following an anonymous complaint alleging irregular treatment practices and undocumented patient transfers. A complaint that, according to the single paragraph I could find referencing it, had been investigated and closed within 2 months, with the state's report concluding that no evidence of wrongdoing was substantiated, a phrase that in my experience usually means either that nothing happened or that whoever was supposed to substantiate it didn't look very hard. I found one more thing before the shoot. Buried in a digitized collection of old employee newsletters the Historical Society had scanned as part of some grant-funded archiving project. A short item from a 1971 staff bulletin, announcing, in the flat, cheerful tone institutional newsletters always used for everything, that Dr. Thomas Halloway has accepted a research fellowship at a facility out of state, effective immediately, and will not be returning to Blackwater. We wish him well. No further explanation. No mention of who took over his patients or where his research notes went or why a staff doctor would leave a position that abruptly, with no transition period, mentioned at all. I remember reading that item 3 or 4 times, feeling a low, persistent unease I couldn't fully name, before I finally set it aside and told myself it was probably nothing. The kind of thing you tell yourself constantly in this line of work. Because if you stopped to fully sit with every unsettling detail you found in a record search, you'd never actually go inside any of these buildings at all. We got through the fence a little after 10 p.m., cut through an access point in the perimeter that a previous explorer's video had shown us, and made our way across an overgrown lawn toward the main administration building, a 4-story brick structure with most of its windows broken, and a set of double doors hanging half off their hinges. The plan, like the plan on every shoot, was simple. Get good footage, cover as much of the campus as we could before dawn, and get out before any actual security patrol. The county still sent someone by twice a week, mostly to shoo off teenagers. Happened to swing through. The administration building was ordinary by the standards of these places, peeling paint, water damage cascading down the walls in long rust-colored streaks, the specific smell that all abandoned buildings of a certain age develop, something between wet rot and old paper. We filmed for about 40 minutes on the ground floor, moved up to the second, and it was there, in what had once been an administrative office, that Priya found the ledger. It was sitting on top of a rusted filing cabinet, oddly undamaged given the state of everything around it, bound in cracked green leather. And when she opened it, the pages inside were still legible. A patient intake log from 1968, names and admission dates, and, in a column, labeled simply Ward, a series of numbers. Most of these say Ward 4, Ward 2, Ward 5, Priya said, flipping through slowly while Derek filmed over her shoulder. There's no Ward 7 on the campus map, is there? I pulled up the facility layout I'd found online before the shoot. A hand-drawn diagram scanned from some historical society archive. 6 wards numbered 1 through 6, spread across 3 connected buildings. No 7. Maybe it's a typo, Derek said. Priya turned another page, and another, and stopped on an entry near the back of the ledger, dated March 1971. She read it out loud, and I want to reproduce, as best I remember it, exactly what she said, because it's the first thing that night that made the hair on my arm stand up before anything had actually happened yet. Patient transferred to Ward 7 per Dr. Halloway's order. Family not to be informed of transfer location. No further correspondence to be forwarded. That's dark, Derek said, in the tone he used for things that were unsettling but explainable. The tone that had gotten us both through 2 years of exploring buildings that specialized in unsettling but explainable things. There's more, Priya said. And she kept reading, and every entry from that point forward in the ledger followed the same pattern. A patient transferred to Ward 7. Family not informed, no further correspondence, over and over, at least 11 times across the final 20 pages of the log, the handwriting growing progressively more hurried, more slanted, as though whoever was recording these entries had been writing faster and faster, right up until the ledger simply stopped, mid-page. In April of 1971, with no further entries at all. We should have left then. I want to be honest about that, in hindsight, the way you're always honest in hindsight about the exact moment you should have turned around and didn't. But we didn't leave. We did what people like us do, which is get more interested, not less. And we spent the next hour trying to find some physical trace of a 7th ward that didn't appear on any map we had. We found it in the basement, the main administration building connected to the rest of the campus, through an underground tunnel system, standard for institutions of that era, meant to let staff move between buildings without going outside in bad weather. Most of the tunnels were flooded or collapsed, well documented in other explorers' footage, generally considered impassable past the first 100 feet. What wasn't well documented, what didn't appear in anyone's footage that I'd ever seen, was a side passage about 60 feet in, behind a section of collapsed ceiling that had clearly, at some point, been deliberately pulled down to block it. Not decay, not age, but a controlled collapse. Beams cut and dropped, rubble piled with a kind of intentionality that decay simply doesn't produce. Someone, at some point, had gone to a lot of trouble to make sure nobody found what was on the other side. Derek found the gap first, a narrow space at the top of the rubble pile, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through if they were willing to crawl. He looked back at me with an expression I'd seen on him 100 times before. The specific, delighted grin of someone who's just found the best footage of the night, and I want you to understand that in 2 years of working with Derek, that grin had never once preceded anything actually dangerous. It had preceded broken elevator shafts, collapsed roofs, one memorable encounter with a family of raccoons that had taken over a nursing station. It had never, not once, preceded anything that couldn't be explained by the end of the night. "Ward 7, he said. "Has to be." I want to tell you I argued against going through. I didn't, not really. I asked if we were sure, which is not the same thing. And when Priya and Derek both said yes without hesitation, I picked up my camera and went in right behind them. Because that's the job, and because some part of me, the same part that had built a career out of walking into abandoned buildings for a living, wanted to see it too. The passage on the other side of the rubble opened into a short corridor, narrower than the rest of the tunnel system, with a different quality to the brickwork. Older, somehow, though that didn't make sense given everything else we knew about the building's construction date. The air was colder here, noticeably, immediately. The kind of cold that has weight to it that you feel on your skin like a hand pressed flat against you. The corridor ended at a heavy steel door, rusted but intact, with a small barred window at eye level, and a manual lock mechanism instead of anything electronic. Older than the doors we'd seen anywhere else in the complex. A design that belonged to an earlier decade of institutional construction, or to a part of the building that had been built or modified with a very different purpose in mind than the wards upstairs. The door wasn't locked. It swung open with a groan that Derek's camera mic picked up so clearly that when I watched the footage back weeks later, the only footage from that section of tunnel that survived intact, I had to turn the volume down, because something about the specific pitch of that sound did something to my chest that no amount of time has fully undone. Ward 7 was a single long room, low-ceilinged, lined on both sides with what had once been individual cells rather than the shared dormitory-style rooms we'd seen in the wards upstairs. 8 cells total, 4 on each side, each with its own barred door standing open, each one empty, each one according to every reading on Priya's EMF meter, which she'd brought along mostly as a joke, mostly for the YouTube audience who expected that kind of prop, registering readings so high the display simply flashed an error and refused to give a number. "This isn't in any of the campus records," Priya said, her voice lower than I'd heard it all night. "This isn't a patient ward. Look at the doors. Look at the way these cells are built. This is—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Anyone who spent time researching institutions of that era knows what a room like this usually was. Tucked away below the main floors, sealed off behind a controlled collapse, absent from every official record, a place for patients the institution didn't want anyone, including its own future administrators, to ever ask about again. We filmed for another 20 minutes. I want to walk you through exactly what happened in that 20 minutes. Because I've gone over it so many times since that I could probably recite it in my sleep, and because I think the order matters. I think in hindsight that whatever was down there escalated with a kind of patience that mirrored the patience of the building itself, testing us, the way you'd test ice before deciding how much weight to put on it. The first thing was the sound, a slow, dragging scrape from somewhere near the far end of the ward. The kind of sound a heavy object makes moving across a rough floor, except there was nothing on that floor to make it. Nothing any of us could see when we swept our lights toward the source. Derek caught it on camera. When I watched the footage back later, alone, at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, I counted the sound occurring 4 separate times across roughly 90 seconds, always from the same direction, always the exact same length, like a recording caught in a loop rather than something happening in real time. Between the first and second things, there was an interval of a few minutes I haven't described yet, mostly because it's harder to put into words than the sound or the meter reading, and because at the time, none of us said anything about it out loud, the way you don't mention a feeling you're hoping is only yours. I felt it as a kind of pressure at the base of my skull, faint at first, then building, the specific sensation of being watched by something positioned slightly behind and above you, no matter which direction you turned to face it. Priya mentioned, weeks later, that she'd felt the same thing, and had assumed at the time that it was simply her own nerves. Derek never got the chance to tell us what he'd felt, and that absence, the fact that I will never actually know what he experienced in those last clear minutes before whatever happened to him happened, is one of the specific griefs I've never quite figured out how to file away. We kept the cameras rolling the entire time, which is the only reason I have any external record of what happened next at all, since so much of my own memory of that stretch has come apart the way I've described. Priya's meter kept cycling through its pattern, faster now, and I remember commenting, on camera, in a voice that sounds almost unbearably casual to me now when I watch the footage back, that we should probably wrap up soon, that we'd gotten more than enough for the video, that there was something about the air down there that was starting to genuinely bother me in a way I couldn't articulate to the camera without sounding unprofessional. Derek didn't respond to that comment. In the footage, you can see him already starting to drift toward the far cell, slowly, almost absently, the way you'd wander toward a sound you weren't consciously tracking. And Priya, reviewing that same footage with me months later, pointed out something neither of us had noticed in the moment. His gait had changed, subtly, somewhere in those few seconds, from his normal, loose, confident walk into something stiffer, more deliberate, each foot placed with a careful precision that had nothing to do with the uneven floor. The second thing was Priya's EMF meter, which had been throwing errors since we walked in, suddenly resolving to a stable, specific reading. And then, as she watched, the numbers began cycling, slowly, deliberately, through a sequence that repeated 3 times before she lowered the device with hands that had started, visibly, to shake. "That's not random," she said. "EMF doesn't do that. It doesn't cycle through a pattern like that, unless something's actively—" She stopped again. "It's counting something, or spelling something. I don't know which." The third thing, and the thing that ended the night, was Derek's voice. He'd walked ahead of us, toward the last cell on the left side, the one closest to the dragging sound, camera still rolling, narrating for the footage in the easy professional cadence he always used. The cadence that had never once in 2 years wavered into anything I hadn't heard from him before. And then it wavered. "Guys," he said, And something in the single syllable of that word made both Priya and I turn immediately. Lights swinging toward him. He was standing at the threshold of the last cell, not moving, camera still pointed forward, and his voice, when he spoke again, had dropped into a register I had never heard him use. Flat and slow, each word arriving with a strange, deliberate spacing, like he was translating each one from somewhere else, before he said it out loud. "There's someone already in here." The cell, when our lights reached it fully, was empty. I want to be completely clear about that. Empty. 4 bare walls, a rusted drain in the center of the floor. Nothing else. No furniture, no debris. Nothing a person could hide behind or within. Derek was looking directly into that empty cell with an expression of focused, quiet attention. The expression of a man having a conversation with someone standing directly in front of him. "Derek." I said his name twice before he responded, and when he finally turned toward me, it took a full 3 seconds. I counted them later, from the footage, 3 full seconds, for something in his eyes to shift back into recognition. Into him. Into the Derek I'd worked beside for 2 years. "Sorry," he said. "Sorry, I think I need to sit down for a second." We got him out of the ward. I want to skip ahead slightly here because the next part happened fast and because I've had to reconstruct it partly from Priya's account since my own memory of it comes apart at the edges in a way that frightens me almost as much as the events themselves. A specific, targeted kind of forgetting that I've since read is common in cases like this, though I don't know who to trust for information like that, since nobody credible seems willing to study it directly. We got Derek back through the gap in the rubble, back into the main tunnel, and he seemed, for a few minutes, to be recovering, pale, shaky, but present, apologizing for whatever had happened, saying he didn't know what had come over him, that he'd just felt suddenly, overwhelmingly cold and dizzy, and had needed a second to steady himself. Priya, the nurse, took his pulse, checked his pupils with her phone flashlight, and pronounced him, cautiously, "Probably fine. Probably just a combination of the cold and the late hour, low blood sugar, the ordinary explanations we reach for because the alternative is unbearable." We started back toward the main building's basement stairs. Derek was walking between us, steadier by the minute, making a joke. I don't remember what it was. I've tried and tried to remember, and it's simply gone. Erased along with several other details from that stretch of tunnel that I know happened, but cannot access anymore. The way you know you had a dream, but can't recall its content, just the fact of having had it. And then Derek stopped walking. He didn't fall. He didn't stumble. He simply stopped, mid-stride, one foot still lifted slightly off the ground, and stood there, completely still, for long enough that Priya and I had both turned back to him, before either of us fully registered that something was wrong. His eyes were open. His chest, when I finally forced myself to look, close enough to see clearly, was not moving. "Derek!" Nothing. "Derek!" Priya got to him first, checked his pulse with hands that I could see shaking even in the poor light, and found one. Faint, she said, but there, slow and irregular but present. Which meant he was, by every definition. Either of us understood in that moment. Still alive, just utterly, inexplicably, unresponsive, standing upright in a collapsing tunnel 60 feet underground, with his eyes open and nothing behind them that either of us could reach. We called for help. I want you to understand that called for help, 60 feet underground in a tunnel system, with no cell signal, meant one of us going back the way we'd come, alone, in the dark, while the other stayed with Derek. And I want to be honest that neither Priya nor I wanted to do either of those things, and that we spent almost a full minute arguing about it in increasingly panicked whispers before she finally said the thing that ended the argument. I'm the one with medical training. I need to stay with him. You need to go get signal and call an ambulance, and you need to go now because I don't like what his pulse is doing. I ran. I want to tell you I remember every step of that run back through the tunnel, up the basement stairs, across the overgrown lawn to the perimeter fence. But the truth is I don't. It's another gap, another piece of that night that simply isn't there anymore when I reach for it. Just fragments. The specific sound of my own breathing. The beam of my flashlight jumping wildly across brick walls. A moment near the top of the basement stairs where I was absolutely certain, with a certainty that had nothing to do with anything I could see or hear, that something was following close behind me, matching my pace exactly, close enough that if I'd reached back I might have touched it. I got signal about 100 feet past the perimeter fence and called 911, and I have to tell you, giving my location to a 911 dispatcher, trying to explain that my friend was frozen upright in a hidden tunnel underneath an abandoned psychiatric hospital, that we'd found a room that wasn't on any map, that something had spoken through him and he'd collapsed mid-sentence. I have never in my life felt as completely, helplessly insane as I felt on that call. And I have never been more grateful for a dispatcher who, despite clearly not believing half of what I was saying, sent an ambulance and a sheriff's deputy anyway, because that's the job, and because somewhere in the training they get, someone had apparently told them that Blackwater generated calls like this often, enough not to simply hang up on them. I led the paramedics and the deputy back to the fence gap, back across the lawn, back into the basement. And it was there, at the top of the basement stairs, that the deputy, a woman in her 40s named Deputy Hargrove, who I would later learn had responded to no fewer than 6 prior incidents at Blackwater over her career. A fact she did not volunteer to me that night, but which I found out later through a public records request. Stopped us all cold with a raised hand. "Everyone stay here a second," she said, and something in her voice, flat and controlled in a way that suggested long practice at sounding calm when she wasn't, made every one of us obey immediately. She drew her flashlight and her weapon, both, and moved toward the tunnel entrance alone. And I remember thinking, in that strange, suspended moment, that a woman who'd clearly done this before, who'd walked toward that tunnel entrance with a gun drawn at night, more than once in her career, was more frightening to me in that instant than anything the building itself had done, because her caution was not the caution of someone worried about structural collapse or trespassing teenagers. It was the specific, weary caution of someone who already knew, in general terms if not in specifics, what might be waiting. She came back 40 seconds later and waved the paramedics forward, and I want to tell you what we found when we reached Priya and Derek, because it is the detail that I have never been able to explain to anyone's satisfaction, including my own. Priya was exactly where we'd left her, kneeling beside Derek, who was still standing. I want you to sit with that, because I have never stopped sitting with it. Still standing upright in the exact position he'd frozen in, more than 20 minutes after he'd stopped moving, without falling, without swaying, without any of the small involuntary adjustments a standing human body makes even at rest. The paramedics got him down onto a backboard with visible effort, and one of them, a young man who looked barely older than me, said something under his breath to his partner that I wasn't meant to hear but did anyway. Rigors already setting in his hands. "That's not possible. He's still got a pulse." I don't know what that means medically. I've asked 3 different doctors since that night in vague hypothetical terms, careful never to give them the actual context, and gotten 3 different answers, all of them essentially amounting to, "that shouldn't happen," which is not the same as an explanation, and which I've come to understand over the following months is the answer you get to almost every question about what actually happened to Derek in that tunnel. It shouldn't happen, and yet, Derek is alive. I want to say that clearly, because I know how this kind of story usually ends, and I know what you're probably braced for by now. He is alive in the sense that his heart beats and his lungs draw breath and his body, 18 months later, continues to function. He has not spoken a single word since that night. He has not, according to his family, who I still visit every few weeks even though it gets harder every time, shown any sign of recognizing anyone who visits him, including his own mother. He sits mostly in a chair by a window at a long-term care facility, 2 hours from here, and according to the staff, he sleeps very little, and when he does sleep, He sleeps with his eyes open, and more than one night nurse has told his family, quietly, off the record, that they've heard him talking in his sleep, in a voice that isn't quite his own, saying the same handful of words over and over that none of them can make sense of. I asked one of the nurses, once, gently, what the words were. She looked at me for a long moment before she answered. The way you look at someone you're deciding whether to trust with something you'd rather not say out loud. He says 7 wants company. Over and over. Sometimes for hours. She paused. I don't know what it means. I try not to think about it too hard, if I'm honest. Some things you're better off not turning over in your head. I know exactly what it means, and I have never once told her, or Derek's family, or anyone outside of Priya, the full context of what happened underground, because I don't know what good it would do them, and because some part of me is afraid that saying it out loud, fully, completely, in the wrong room, might be exactly the kind of invitation that something patient enough to wait 50 years in a sealed-off ward would recognize as an opening. The official report, the one filed by the county, the one the sheriff's department eventually closed, attributes Derek's condition to a medical event, unspecified, possibly related to exposure, hypothermia, or an underlying condition no one knew he had, occurring coincidentally during our exploration of the tunnel system. Nobody in an official capacity has ever, to my knowledge, acknowledged the existence of Ward 7. Though when I went back to the county records office months later, working up the nerve the way I had for the previous story I'm not supposed to reference, and requested the original architectural blueprints for Blackwater State Hospital, I was told, politely, that the full set of blueprints had been lost in a records transfer sometime in the 1980s, and that what remained on file was a partial set, missing several pages, including, when I checked specifically, every page that would have shown the basement level in detail. I spent the better part of the following year trying to find out who Dr. Thomas Halloway actually was and what happened to him after he left Blackwater in 1971. Because I had become convinced, in the specific, obsessive way grief makes you convinced of things, that understanding him would somehow help me understand what had happened to Derek, or at least give me something to point to besides the shapeless, unsatisfying answer of something in an old building hurt my friend, and nobody can tell me what. It took months, and most of what I found came from sources that felt, at every step, like they'd rather I didn't find them at all. A state licensing board database, digitized only partially, showed a Thomas J. Halloway, licensed to practice psychiatry in this state from 1958 until 1971, when his license was quietly allowed to lapse, not revoked, not suspended, simply allowed to expire without renewal. A bureaucratic non-event that would never have shown up in any search unless you were looking for it specifically. No record of him practicing anywhere else in the country afterward under that name. No obituary I could find, though public obituary archives from that era are spotty enough that this told me less than I wanted it to. I found one substantive thing, eventually, through a research forum for medical historians, where someone, years earlier, had posted a partial transcript of a 1972 Legislative Committee hearing, the same hearing I'd found a brief reference to before the shoot, the one that concluded no evidence of wrongdoing was substantiated. The forum post included several pages of testimony that had apparently been excluded from the official published summary. Testimony from a former Blackwater staff nurse, identified only by the initials MR, given under some kind of limited immunity arrangement, that suggested the committee had taken her concerns more seriously than the final report let on. I'm going to paraphrase what she said because reading the actual transcript language is difficult in a way that's hard to describe, clinical and detached in exactly the wrong places. She described a wing of the hospital, unmarked on any staff orientation materials, where a small number of patients, she estimated somewhere between 8 and 15 over the years she worked there, were transferred following what she called unusual episodes. A phrase the committee pressed her to define, and which she apparently struggled, on the record, to make more specific, saying only that these were patients who had begun, in her words, talking about things or as things that weren't there, in a way that seemed to spread to other patients on the same ward if they weren't moved quickly. She testified that Dr. Holloway ran an informal research program focused on these patients, that families were told the transfers were for specialized care at an unspecified facility, and that she had personally witnessed at least 2 instances where a patient transferred to what she called the lower ward never appeared on any subsequent patient roster she had access to, as though they had simply stopped existing within the hospital's own record-keeping the moment they went downstairs. The committee's response, according to the Forum Post, was to thank her for her testimony and move on to the next witness without a single follow-up question, which struck me, reading it decades later, as its own kind of answer. I never found out what happened to Dr. Holloway after 1971. I have a theory which I want to share cautiously, because it is nothing more than a theory, built on a feeling I can't fully justify with evidence. I think whatever he was studying down there stopped being something he could control at some point before he left, and I think accepted a research fellowship out of state, was the kind of sentence an institution writes when it needs a clean, plausible explanation for someone who left far less voluntarily than that phrase implies. I think about the controlled collapse that sealed off that tunnel passage, the deliberately cut and dropped ceiling beams, and I think about who would have had the authority and the motive to order that kind of containment sometime shortly after Holloway's departure, and I keep arriving at the same uncomfortable, unprovable conclusion. That whoever sealed Ward 7 wasn't trying to keep people out. They were trying to keep something in, and they did it in the hastiest, least careful way available to them, because by that point, they were no longer thinking about doing it properly. They were thinking about doing it fast. I haven't been back to Blackwater. Priya hasn't either. She left nursing about 8 months after that night for reasons she's never fully explained to me, even though we still talk regularly. And she told me once, the only time we've discussed the details of that night since it happened, that she doesn't think what came through Derek was interested in him specifically, any more than a fire is interested in the specific piece of wood it happens to catch first. I think it was just testing which one of us would let it in the farthest, she said. Derek got closest to the empty cell. I think that's the only reason it was him and not one of us. I think if either of us had walked to that cell first instead of him, we'd be the one in that chair by the window, and he'd be the one telling this story instead of me. I think about that a lot. I think about the 11 names in that ledger, transferred to a ward that didn't exist on any map, families told nothing, correspondence cut off entirely. And I think about how many of them might still be down there, in whatever sense something can still be somewhere after 50 years. Patient, waiting behind a controlled collapse, someone built specifically to keep the rest of the world from ever finding that room again. Someone sealed that passage on purpose. I think about that more than almost anything else. Somebody, back in 1971 or thereabouts, understood exactly what was in that ward, and instead of trying to help whatever was left there, or even simply document it for whoever came after, they knocked down a ceiling and buried the whole problem in rubble and let 50 years of silence do the rest of the work. And it worked, mostly. It worked until 3 idiots, with cameras and an EMF meter, found a gap at the top of a rubble pile, just wide enough to squeeze through, and asked the one question you should never ask about a room somebody went to that much trouble to make sure nobody ever found. What's inside? There's a period of about 6 weeks, roughly 2 months after the incident, that I haven't mentioned yet, mostly because I've never been sure how to fit it into the story without it sounding like I'm reaching for drama that wasn't there. But it happened, and Priya can confirm the broad shape of it, even though neither of us has ever fully compared notes on the details, because comparing notes meant talking about it, and for a long time, neither of us wanted to talk about it at all. I drove back out to Blackwater once, alone, about 8 weeks after the incident. I want to be clear that I had no intention of going inside. I told myself, driving out there in the middle of a gray Sunday afternoon, that I just needed to see the building again in daylight from outside the fence to prove to myself that it was just a building. Brick and broken glass and overgrown grass. Nothing more than that. The same kind of building I'd walked into dozens of times before without anything following me home. I parked on the shoulder of the access road about a quarter-mile out, the same spot we'd parked the night of the shoot. And I sat there for a long time before I even got out of the car, watching the building through the windshield. The way you'd watch a sleeping animal you weren't sure was actually asleep. When I finally did get out and walk closer, staying well outside the perimeter fence, I felt that same pressure at the base of my skull I'd felt in the tunnel, faint but unmistakable, present the entire time I stood there, gone the instant I turned my back and started walking to the car. I called Priya that night, the first time either of us had really talked since the week after the incident. Both of us too raw to manage more than logistics calls about Derek's care in the interim. I told her what I'd felt, and there was a long silence on the line before she answered. "I went out there too," she said. "Same week as you, I think. Maybe a few days apart. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to think I was losing it." "What did you feel?" "The same thing you're describing. Watched. But there was something else, Cass. I stood at the fence for maybe 10 minutes, and the whole time, I had this specific, awful certainty that if I waited long enough, it would come to the fence to look back at me. Not chase me. Just come see who was looking. I left before I found out if I was right, and I've never gone back, and I'm never going back, and I really wish you hadn't gone either. Because I think every time one of us goes near that place, we're telling it, we're still thinking about it, and I don't think that's a message we want to keep sending." Priya left nursing 4 months after that phone call. She's never given me a full explanation, and I've never pushed for one because I understand, better than almost anyone else could, that some decisions get made in a private, wordless place that doesn't survive being explained out loud. The one thing she did tell me, the only time we've discussed it since, is that she started noticing, in the months after Blackwater, that she couldn't be alone with a patient in a quiet room anymore without feeling that same pressure at the base of her skull, the sense of being watched from a position slightly behind and above, and that she'd started, without meaning to, glancing at empty corners of hospital rooms the way you'd glance at a doorway you expected someone to walk through. "I don't think it followed me," she said, when I asked, gently, whether she thought that was what was happening. "I think it's more that I can't stop checking for it now, everywhere, all the time, and that's not a way to do the kind of work I used to do. You can't take care of people properly while you're watching the corners of the room instead of watching them." I want to tell you about one of my visits to Derek specifically because it's the reason I finally stopped trying to find a rational explanation for any of this and started, instead, simply trying to live with not having one. It was about 10 months after that night on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and I'd gotten into the habit of bringing a book to read out loud during my visits, on the theory, which nobody at the facility either encouraged or discouraged, but which felt better than sitting in silence, that some part of him might still be listening, even if nothing in his face or posture ever confirmed it. I was maybe 20 minutes into a chapter, when Derek's hand, which had been resting motionless in his lap the entire visit, the way it always did, slowly closed around the arm of his chair. I stopped reading. I want to be honest that my first reaction wasn't hope. It was fear. A sudden, total fear that whatever had taken him that night in the tunnel was still in there with him, still capable of moving him, and that I was about to see it use his body for something other than sitting quietly by a window. His head turned, slowly, toward me, and his eyes, which for 10 months had held the specific, unfocused stillness of someone looking at nothing, focused, briefly, unmistakably, on my face. "Cass." My name. His voice, cracked from disuse but recognizably his own. Not the flat, wrong register I'd heard in the tunnel. "You have to stop looking for him, Holloway." He knows you're looking. It's how it found me. It found me through what I already knew about that ward before we even went down there, do you understand? It doesn't come looking. It waits for you to come looking for it. I called for a nurse immediately, my hands shaking too badly to actually do anything useful myself, and by the time anyone arrived, less than 90 seconds later, Derek had gone still again. His hand loose on the arm of the chair, his eyes unfocused, his face wearing the same blank stillness it had worn every single day since October 4th. The nurse checked his vitals, found nothing unusual, and gently, kindly, suggested that these kinds of momentary reactions weren't uncommon in patients with his particular condition. Small reflexive movements that families sometimes mistook, understandably, for something more. I know what I heard. I know it wasn't a reflex. And I know he said my name. And I know he told me to stop looking. And I want you to understand that I did stop immediately, completely, that same week. I abandoned the research into Holloway I'd already done, deleted most of my notes, and told myself I would never again try to learn one more fact about Blackwater State Hospital, or the man who'd built Ward 7 or whatever it was he'd left down there when he disappeared from every official record in 1971. I kept that promise for almost a year. I'm breaking it right now telling you this. And I want to be honest about the fact that some part of me is frightened even saying these words out loud on a recording that people are going to watch, because if Derek was right, if it doesn't come looking, if it waits for you to come looking for it, then I have to assume that telling this story, putting it into the world where thousands of people will hear the name of that hospital, and maybe some of them go looking for it themselves the way we did, is exactly the kind of attention that patient, still waiting thing has been hoping for all along. I've decided to tell it anyway because I think the alternative, letting Blackwater keep collecting curious people who don't know what happened to the last ones who went looking, is worse than the risk of one more video, reaching one more person who might, God willing, take the warning seriously enough to stay out. I know the answer now. I wish every single day that I didn't, and I would give almost anything I own to trade that knowledge back for the version of Derek who used to grin at me across a camera lens every time we found something good, instead of the version of him sitting silently by a window saying the same 4 words into the dark to something that is, as far as I can tell, still very patiently waiting for the rest of us to come back.